Hi guys, thanks for watching our video. We're going to explain some important topics about the approaches to second language cognitive. So this is more cognitive. This is not only just how to learn something, it's more how our memory works. So let's start with this important topic, which is about we're going to see some Krashen's theories, which is really important. Was an important person to this topic because he was a researcher just trying to find some information on how the memory works and how can we acquire a language or how the children acquires language per se. So now let's start with the monitoring. Well, the monitor hypothesis explains the relationship between the acquisition and learning and defines the influence of latter of the former. Well, and what happened? The monitor function is this practical result. Learning grammar, according to Krashen, the acquisition system is the adherence of the initiator, while the learning system performs the role of the monitor and the editor. So now, let's continue with some important things for Krashen, which is the role of grammar for Krashen's view. Well, in this case, according to Krashen's, the study of the structure of the language can have a general and educational purposes in high school, and colleagues may want to include in their language programs. Any benefit, however, will greatly depend on the learner being already familiar with the language. So it's quite important. Now we're gonna continue with the input. So what happened with this? It's quite important, the input hypothesis, because it's Krashen attempt to explain how the learners acquire second languages per se, how the second language acquisition take place. Well, the input hypothesis, it's only concerned with the acquisition and not the learning. I mean, how can we get this information from us? Just watching a movie, just give us some language from other people. The learner improves and progresses along the natural order. When he receives second languages input, I mean just any kind of input we can receive. I mean, listening to music, everything. I mean, so for example, that if the learner is on a stage I, then the acquisition takes place when he exposes the comprehensive whole input. I mean, you cannot just give some input that you cannot understand. So is pretty important to understand how can the input can improve our language. Now I'm gonna continue with the filter, the active filter hypothesis, and this is basically based on some variables that learning can live while he's acquiring a language. These variables can be motivation. It's really important to be motivated when we are just in learning processes or in acquiring processes, because if we are not motivated, we are just not getting that information from us. Then we have the self-confidence. The self-confidence is just trust in us, trust in our skills. Then the other variable that can affect how can we acquire a language would be the anxiety and personality traits. From Krashen claims that learners with high motivations and low anxiety and extroversion are better equipped for a success in a second language. That's really it's pretty obvious, I mean, because you realize that if you are not just if you have some anxiety, then you are not have self motivation, you won't learn a language, you won't acquire a language, because it's not for you, and then you don't have any to do with you if you don't want to learn something. So now let's continue with the natural order, which in this case this theory suggests that the acquisition of grammatical structures follow a natural order. I mean, you cannot learn something that you cannot even understand how it works. So first we have to start with the beginning, or the beginning of the easiest things to learn, or the most useful things to learn. For given a language, for some grammatical structures which are really important to use a language, then we have tend to acquire early while others late. These orders seem to be independent of the learner's age. For instance, language 1, background condition to exposure. The first language, it's really important from us because we are going to take some important ideas for important concepts of our modern language. So it's super important just to try to combine or to use some skills that we already use in a first language, then acquire or then to use it in our language. And basically that would be my part. Now we're going to continue with Laura's. She's going to explain some important topics. So let's start with her.
Okay, as we already know, we have a working memory, and for our processing learning a second language, its working memory is the term that we use to refer to the process involving the temporary storage during the online cognitive operations. We have some models of working memory that, according to Badley and Hitch theory, that explain that there are two principal components. First, the temporary storage of information, like we already know, the short-term memory, and the second is the control of that information, the executive attention. And also, the role of working memory in this second language acquisition, with what we already saw, is that this is instrumental in the acquisition of new vocabulary and in more global measures of acquisition. Like, for example, Daneman and Green in 1986 found that in playing a significant role of determining how easily elementary school children extracted word meanings from context. Finally, according to this many research that help us to understand better our learning process or our second acquisition process. So hi, now we're going to talk about the role of memory systems and conscious learning. In the last chapter, we saw how the constructionist, statistical, and the implicit learning show us the different learning mechanisms that could help us in the learning process. Now we are going to go deeper about associative learning, how important the memory for our learning process. First, we must understand that we as humans, we have two types of knowledge: the declarative knowledge and the procedural knowledge. First, the declarative knowledge is the language. In the language is the meta-linguistic knowledge, or as the knowledge of vocabulary or some rules. We must remember that the metalinguistic knowledge is the possibility of explaining, correct, or describe something that we already know in the correct way. The procedural knowledge is the same as implicit knowledge. It's like the how to do something. In this reading, according to the last chapters, we saw that many research were created searching how these two knowledge are involved in the second language acquisition. Some of them were focused on the neurolinguistic techniques because they want to know which of the two knowledge is more important in the language acquisition process. For example, in the explicit knowledge, the learner wants an explicit knowledge, and this knowledge could be accessible by self-effort. Another thing that we have to understand in this chapter is that we have some skills according to some acquisition theories. There are three stages of learning that have generally been proposed. First, stage 1, that is cognitive, declarative, or presentation, where the learners create a new explicit knowledge based on the information that they could receive by teachers, books, or even by themselves. The representation of this knowledge is activated in the working memory. The stage 2, the associative, procedural, or practice, this knowledge becomes in procedural knowledge, that is information about how to do anything. It helps to put this previous knowledge in practice, what we learned before. And stage 3, the autonomous automatic or production. In this case, the self process is very important because we already have a knowledge, but in this case, we need a lot of practice if we want some kind of automatization in our real process. Because if we want a faster process, we don't need mistakes, and if we have mistakes, it is because we don't have the enough practice. Learning strategies. The conscious knowledge of the strategy is like the use of known linguistic information to facilitate a new learning for any task that we can apply for our